deep, steady documentary voice, calm but serious, tone clear, enunciation, no exaggeration, smooth pacing. Avoid over-dramatic pauses. Space is not empty. It is alive. It watches. It remembers. For every explorer who dares to cross its silence, there are places that were never meant to be seen, doors that were never meant to be opened, and eyes that should never, ever look back. This is the voyage of Kael, the cartographer who believed he was mapping the edge of the universe. But in truth, the universe was mapping him. Welcome to the Obsidian Voyager. The Aetheria cut through the black void, its warp core humming a lonely, resonant lullaby. Kael, the ship's sole pilot and cartographer, was charting the fringe of the Cygnus Rift, a stellar nursery notorious for stellar anomalies. He targeted a newly forming G-type star, designated Locus 7, expecting routine plasma readings. What he saw defied every known law of astrophysics. Locus 7 was not a churning sphere of hydrogen and helium. It was focused. At its core, the blinding light was perfectly shielded by a corona of opaque, swirling magnetic fields, leaving a central dark void, a pupil. The plasma surrounding the void was layered in complex chromatic bands, forming an undeniable, enormous iris. The star was looking back. Kael's blood turned to ice. He watched the light in the pupil subtly contract, tracking the Aetheria's slow, cautious drift. This wasn't a natural phenomenon, it was a sentient aperture, a cosmic eye fixed directly on his vessel. He checked the energy readings. The star's output was stable, but a focused, non-thermal beam of radiation, a high-energy gaze, was locked onto his ship. He knew he couldn't fight it and he couldn't hide. The entity was calculating his mass, trajectory, and intent. Kael slammed the thrusters into reverse, pouring emergency power into the engines, pulling a tight, agonizing G-force maneuver to escape the system's gravity well. As the Aetheria screamed away at maximum sublight speed, Kael risked one final glance at the view screen. The colossal cosmic eye was no longer tracking him with a subtle drift. The iris abruptly snapped shut, the swirling plasma contracting, and Locus 7 became a momentary perfect black sphere. In the next instant, the star violently blinked open, releasing a focused burst of gamma radiation exactly where the Aetheria had been seconds before. Kael pushed the ship into a blind jump, the last image of the colossal silent eye seared into his memory. Conclusion. Kael survives the intense scrutiny of the conscious star and escapes the system, narrowly avoiding its destructive, focused blink. Kael found himself caught in the gravitational pull of a small, stable black hole, a rarity known as a Kleinfold singularity. Instead of being shredded by spaghettification, the Aetheria was pulled smoothly into a cylindrical field of impossible silence. The black hole's event horizon resolved into a structure, a corridor of polished basalt-like material stretching infinitely into directions. Along its walls were thousands of equidistant, identical steel doors, each marked only by a pulsing, faint blue light. The air inside was breathable, sterile, and cold. Kael used a drone to approach the nearest door. The analysis was baffling. Each door opened to a distinct reality. One door contained the residual echo of a supernova, another the scent of fresh rain on soil, a third the sound of ancient human music. This was not a tunnel through space, but a transit point through potential. He realized he could spend centuries sampling these doors, but the corridor was beginning to subtly warp, the floor rippling like dark water. The stability was temporary. He had to choose one exit. Rejecting any path that seemed inviting or dangerous, Kael focused on a door with a completely null reading, door 7031. It offered no light, no scent, no sound, and no residual energy. It was a blank slate. Kael piloted the Aetheria directly at the inert door, overriding the automated systems that screamed in protest. The moment the hull passed the threshold, the world dissolved into a brief, violent flash of white. He reappeared abruptly, miles from any charted system, hurtling through familiar, empty, deep space. The Kleinfold singularity and its corridor were gone. Kael checked the chronometer. Only 0.003 seconds had passed internally, but his positional data indicated he had traversed nearly 30,000 light-years. Conclusion: Kael escapes the infinite corridor by choosing a null reality door, resulting in an immediate, extreme jump across vast, uncharted space. The next beacon of mystery was an exoplanet orbiting a white dwarf, a world entirely covered in flawless, silicon-based crystal. It shimmered with an unbearable brilliance, reflecting the distant stars as perfect diamond points. Kael landed the Aetheria on a broad, flat plateau. As he exited the airlock in an environment suit, he saw it, his own reflection, standing about 20 feet away on the glass surface. But the reflection did not stay put. It slid silently out of the crystal, hardening into an identical crystalline copy of Kael, his suit, and his weapon. The glass Kael stood motionless for a moment, then mirrored the real Kael's movements precisely, but with a terrifying 2-second delay. Kael tried raising his hand. The copy raised its hand 2 seconds later. This was not a phantom. It was a conscious, hostile echo, bound by a temporal tether. Kael realized if he fired, the glass Kael would fire 2 seconds later, giving him time to evade. But if he moved slowly, the copy could close the gap. He began a frantic, erratic sprint, dodging and weaving. The glass Kael, burdened by the delay, struggled to keep up, its perfect crystalline body clanking heavily on the surface. Kael noticed the glass Kael was tethered to the spot where it had emerged, an invisible connection running back to a specific point on the glass plateau. He stopped, aiming his plasma cutter not at the copy, but at the crystalline surface directly beneath its feet. He fired a continuous, high-intensity beam. The glass crackled and melted. The glass Kael shrieked, a sound like grinding silica, and attempted to retreat, its movements now frantic and asynchronous. As the source crystal fractured and turned molten, the crystalline copy began to crumble from the feet up, its perfect structure dissolving into glittering dust. Kael watched his own reflection die, then scrambled back into his ship. Conclusion: Kael defeats the hostile, delayed reflection by destroying the specific crystalline point on the planet's surface that served as its anchor. A ghostly fleet drifted through the inky black. 23 derelict starships, perfectly preserved but totally inert. like an underwater graveyard. Kael designated them the Fleet of Charon. The Aetheria's comms array registered only a constant high-frequency static. When Kael docked with the largest vessel, an exploration cruiser named the Morning Star, the static grew intense, vibrating the hull. Kael breached the bridge, finding the crew's skeletons still seated at their posts. But the silence was broken by something far worse than noise. The static resolved itself not into intelligible speech, but into a deafening chorus of voices. They were not spoken, they were thought. A torrent of psychic residue, shards of raw fear, terminal regret, and the overwhelming, shared trauma of their final seconds simultaneously detonated inside Kael's consciousness. The ship of silent echoes was a cosmic recording device. It didn't transmit sound, it captured and perpetually replayed the final bioelectric and psychic emissions of the deceased crew. Kael realized the ships acted like giant floating sponges for agony. The cacophony was paralyzing. Kael shielded his ears, which did nothing, then slammed his helmet visor shut. He stumbled toward the auxiliary power core, realizing the core's enormous capacitors must be the storage medium. He found the central broadcast unit, a pulsating sphere of blue light, deep in engineering. He ripped a cooling line from the main reactor and directed a burst of super-chilled cryogenic fluid at the sphere. The blue light flickered, the sphere groaned, and the mental screams abruptly silenced. Kael stood in the absolute blessed quiet of the tomb ship. The fleet around him was now truly silent, its awful psychic broadcast frozen. He retreated, leaving the Fleet of Charon to its cold, dumb sleep. Conclusion: Kael silences the ghostly fleet by flash freezing the central psychic broadcast unit, escaping the mental torment of the dead crew's final thoughts. Kael encountered a region of space where all light seemed muted, a deep space nebula where the darkness was not an absence but an entity. Soon, the Aetheria was surrounded by shadow entities, masses of non-reflective blackness that absorbed photons entirely. They were converging on his ship, drawn to its power core light, its running lights, even the faint plasma glow from the thrusters. The ship's exterior temperature plummeted as the shadow entities literally tried to consume the heat and light necessary for survival. The shield generators were flickering, unable to cope with the absolute zero temperatures the shadows generated by stealing energy. Kael had a terrible realization. They weren't feeding on matter, they were feeding on luminous energy. He initiated total system shutdown. He cut the main power, killing the warp core, the shields, and all interior and exterior lighting. The Aetheria went instantly dark and cold, drifting inertly. Kael relied on passive thermal readouts and a tiny filtered infrared scope to navigate. The darkness outside became a swirling, searching sea. The shadows, now deprived of a strong energy signature, hesitated, moving chaotically, no longer focused on the ship. Kael, shivering in the cold cabin, used his last reserves of battery power to engage a low-yield ion thruster for a single, precise 10-second burn, propelling the ship in a calculated, parabolic trajectory out of the swarm. He held his breath for what felt like hours, listening to the ship creak in the sub-zero cold. Finally, the passive sensors registered the ambient starlight brightening. They had cleared the boundary. Kael brought the life support and minimal thrusters back online, staring back at the black, harvesting swarm that now looked like a distant, swirling drain of light. Conclusion: Kael survives the energy-draining shadow swarm by initiating a total darkness shutdown and performing an unlit, calculated escape burn. Deep in the intergalactic void, Kael's comms picked up an impossibly old signal. It wasn't distorted by time or distance. It was a perfect, continuous loop of simple, synthesized speech. The message was 742 years old, originating from a long-dead civilization. The message: we are waiting. The ritual requires one. Kael tracked the signal's source to a small airless moon orbiting a defunct frozen gas giant. He landed the Aetheria near the epicenter. There was no antenna, no transmitter array, and no power source. The signal was emanating from a natural geological formation, a piece of quartz-like rock, perfectly fractured and placed upon a pedestal of black obsidian. It was a natural resonator, tuned to the fabric of space-time itself. The ritualistic placement was the key. The pressure, the mineral composition, and the magnetic field of the moon formed a perpetual feedback loop, drawing residual energy from the dead star. The ancient civilization hadn't built a transmitter. They had built a cosmic tuning fork. Kael stood before the stone, the eerie whisper of "the ritual requires one" vibrating against his helmet. He realized that as long as the stone existed, the desperate, hypnotic signal would continue, calling explorers like him across time and space. The one it required was simply a means to silence it, perhaps. Kael aimed his heavy-duty drilling laser at the obsidian base. He blasted the base, causing the fractured resonator rock to topple and smash against the moon dust. The signal stopped. The silence that followed was immense and absolute, a sudden, heavy void where the centuries-old broadcast had been. The mystery was not in the message, but in the terrifying ingenuity of the method. Kael had saved countless future explorers from following a phantom cry into the void. Conclusion: Kael discovers the forgotten signal is generated by a naturally occurring, ritualistically placed resonant rock and silences the centuries-old loop by destroying the artifact. A small, desolate moon, Charon's egg, caught Kael's attention. Data showed unusual tidal forces that were not gravitational but rhythmic. The moon was slowly, minutely expanding and contracting. Kael landed, and the surface felt spongy under the Aetheria's landing struts. Not rock, but something organic, like hardened chitin or thick, rubbery leather. It had a vast bioorganic shell. He deployed a geological probe designed to drill core samples. The drill bit easily pierced the outermost layer, but as it reached the 10-kilometer mark, the drill shuddered and stopped. The entire moon registered a massive non-seismic tremor, a muscle spasm. Kael saw a wave of rippling tension run across the horizon of the moon. The enormous shell was contracting. He had not been drilling for minerals. He had been probing the sensitive dermis of a cosmic-sized sleeping creature. A massive kilometer-wide crack began to spiderweb out from the probe's entry point. A sickly yellow bioluminescent vapor began to vent from the fissure. The creature was waking up. Kael scrambled the Aetheria for an emergency ascent. He had barely cleared the atmosphere when the shell of Charon's egg violently ruptured. The two massive halves of the moon peeled back, slowly, revealing a pulsating red and raw interior, a soft living core radiating intense heat. He jumped to warp speed instantly, leaving the colossal, newborn entity behind, its silent scream echoing only in the rapid, terrified beat of his heart. Conclusion. Kael escapes the moon of Hollowskin just as his drilling operation triggers a massive rhythmic contraction, causing the moon's surface to peel open and reveal its living biological interior. Kael's path led him to a dying red giant that was tearing itself apart in a systematic, terrifying way. The star was not expanding into a nebula. It had split into countless razor-thin orbiting shards of plasma, each shard retaining its extreme gravity and luminosity. The entire system was a colossal, blinding, chaotic clockwork of white-hot solar blades. Kael couldn't navigate by avoiding the fragments, as they were too numerous and fast. He had to calculate the spaces between them. Using predictive quantum mapping, Kael overlaid the chaotic trajectories. He realized the shards, though randomized, created momentary predictable voids, brief, non-repeating windows of safety that lasted less than a single second. The system's deadly beauty was in its precise, lethal patterns. He targeted one of these fleeting voids, a narrow serpentine gap just large enough for the Aetheria's hull. He engaged a complex multi-vector thrust that required absolute precision, placing the ship into the chaotic stream. The shards screamed past the hull, their gravity fields throwing the Aetheria violently. Kael watched the white-hot blades fill the viewports, inches from his death, their blinding light forcing him to rely solely on the instrument readings. For 40 seconds the ship was a pinball, hull alarms shrieking as superheated plasma kissed the shields. The fragmented blades of light screamed past the cockpit, their gravitational shear threatening to tear the Aetheria into atoms. Then the screaming suddenly stopped, and the main display flashed green, void cleared. He had shot the needle. Kael brought the ship to a slow stop, staring back at the beautiful, deadly kaleidoscope of the fractured sun, leaving the system immediately before the blades realigned. Conclusion. Kael successfully navigates the system of solar blades by calculating and utilizing a fleeting, sub-second void between the fast-moving, fragmented sun shards. Kael stumbled upon an asteroid belt that looked normal until he ran a spectral analysis. Every particle, from micrometeorites to kilometer-long rocks, was etched with minuscule, complex data symbols. This wasn't an accretion disk. It was a vast cosmic library hidden inside an asteroid belt, meticulously organized. The particles were not orbiting randomly. They were arranged into orbital sentences and paragraphs. Kael found the librarian's desk, a single, dark, kilometer-wide slate of polished basalt that hung motionless at the belt's very center. He approached it and found a section covered in massive, glowing glyphs. He translated the glyphs using his universal translator software. It was the index, the titled document of the entire archive. It listed volumes on the origins of the strong nuclear force, the history of universal consciousness, and the entropy of time itself. The final line of the titled document was not a title, but a summary. All knowledge cataloged, observer dismissed, protocol, final burn. Kael barely had time to copy the raw data before the entire vast asteroid belt, every particle, every cataloged thought, began a slow, deliberate deorbit. The entire archive was committing suicide, plunging into the gravity well of the nearest inert brown dwarf. The knowledge was too powerful to remain. An ancient race had preserved all of their knowledge only to program its self-destruction the moment an observer found it. Kael fled with the encrypted data, the terrifying glowing lines of the library collapsing into oblivion behind him. Conclusion: Kael discovers a self-destructing cosmic library contained within an asteroid belt and escapes with the index data just before the entire archive falls into a brown dwarf. Kael detected a colossal mass of liquid water, an entire ocean, floating in the vacuum of space far from any planetary body. It was spherical, held together solely by its own gravity, and entirely unfrozen, sustained by an unknown internal process. Massive bioluminescent leviathans moved within the globe of water, their shapes like impossible many-limbed jellyfish and vast unseen serpentine things. Kael carefully approached the sphere, skimming the surface to take a sample. The water wasn't H2O. It was a complex mix of heavy metal isotopes suspended in a hydrogen lattice, a form of water that was incredibly dense and naturally warm. The entire ecosystem was based on heavy elements, thriving on radiation rather than sunlight. As Kael prepared to leave, a movement on the far side of the sphere eclipsed a distant star. A form so vast it defied perspective slowly breached the surface, an entity shaped like a mountain range of soft black tissue and thousands of glowing purple filaments. It was the Leviathan of all Leviathans, its gelatinous mass staining the void. The immense density of the heavy metal water sphere made the creature's surfacing feel like a geological event, not a biological one. Kael realized the smaller creatures were merely the ocean's bioluminescent thoughts, and the ocean itself was the main organism. He ran the thrusters at full power, creating a shockwave of steam and plasma as he exited the gravity well of the enormous water sphere. He watched in the rear view as the gargantuan shape slowly submerged again, the entire ocean glowing ominously as if processing the tiny, brief intrusion. Conclusion: Kael escapes a floating heavy metal ocean after realizing it and its bioluminescent leviathans are part of a single colossal living entity. In a region of space designated the Quiet Zone, where all stellar, gravitational, and electromagnetic activity was strangely absent, Kael found a relic. It was a perfectly spherical, metallic mask, ancient and seamless, drifting. Kael deployed a telepresence drone, equipping it with the mask. As the mask clicked onto the drone's faceplate, the drone's camera feed went violently haywire. Kael saw not the drone's perspective, but an infinity of Kael's. He was drowning in his own potential. In one window, he saw Kael, ruler of a galaxy, laughing maniacally. In another, Kael, a broken vagrant, slowly starving on a derelict ship. In a third, Kael, a famous artist, painting the void. The images were not projections, they were sensory, flooding Kael's mind with the regret, triumph, and sheer terror of infinite parallel selves. The mask was showing him every outcome of every choice he had ever made and ever would make. It wasn't a viewing device, it was a conduit, threatening to overwrite Kael's singular identity with the unbearable weight of infinite realities. Kael fought the dizzying, nauseating flood, feeling his singular self thin to a fragile echo beneath the cacophony of potential. The psychic strain caused blood to stream from his nose and ears. The connection was an extinction event for his identity. He had to sever it. He keyed the drone's self-destruct mechanism. The camera feed instantly went dark. The drone dissolved in a flash of plasma, leaving only the spherical mask drifting inertly in the quiet zone once more. Ko slumped back in his seat, his mind reeling. He was Ko and only Ko, a single, precious reality. He had to keep moving before the silence drew him back to question his own singularity. Conclusion. Ko removes the psychic conduit by destroying the drone wearing the mask of infinity, narrowly escaping the mental collapse caused by seeing infinite versions of himself. Kael encountered a colossal, perfect metallic sphere of unknown composition, hanging stationary in space. It pulsed rhythmically, not with light, but with gravity. The sphere was inhaling and exhaling. When it inhaled, the sphere contracting slightly, the local gravity dropped sharply, plummeting to zero. When it exhaled, the sphere expanding slightly, the gravity spiked violently, crushing the Aetheria with forces that strained the hull integrity. The cycles were exactly 60 seconds long, 30 seconds of weightlessness, 30 seconds of crushing Gs. Kael was caught in the cycle, the Aetheria tumbling helplessly. He realized the sphere was not using gravity, it was manipulating space-time itself, actively stretching and compressing the local volume. During the next zero-gravity inhale, Kael prepared his escape. He calculated the precise vector needed to use the sphere's own gravity well as a slingshot, but the burn had to occur entirely within the 30-second window before the next crushing exhale. He waited for the sphere to contract, 0G. Kael manually engaged the main fusion thrusters, pouring maximum power into the burn. The Aetheria shot forward, accelerating violently. He made it to the edge of the gravitational influence in 28 seconds. The sphere began its exhale. As the ship crossed the threshold of the sphere's influence, the last 2 seconds of the crushing gravity hit the Aetheria like a physical blow, bending the navigation array and cracking a viewport. Kael spun the ship around and jumped instantly, leaving the colossal metallic lung to its silent, deadly respiration. Conclusion. Kael escapes the gravity-breathing sphere by timing a full-power thruster burn during the zero-gravity inhale phase, narrowly avoiding the next crushing exhale. The Aetheria drifted into a nebula shaped like a sprawling forest of luminous, gaseous trees. The branches were made of ionized gas, glowing with a soft, hypnotic light, but the region was acoustically dead. As Kael flew deeper, the silence was violated. He began to hear whispers inside his head, transmitted not through the comms, but directly into his consciousness. They were not malicious, but infinitely sorrowful, ancient and layered, a chorus of collective telepathic grief. Lost. We lost the meaning. Come rest. The waiting is over. The whispers were draining Kael's mental energy, making him tired, lethargic, and deeply empathetic to their cosmic sorrow. He realized the forest of silent sparks was not a formation of gas, but the interconnected neural network of an incredibly vast, dying, species-wide consciousness. They were inviting him to join their eternal lament. Kael fought the overwhelming urge to simply power down and float with them. He had to isolate his mind. He went to the engineering section and physically disconnected the ship's primary sensor conduits from the central CPU. He cut all external sensory input, turning his viewports opaque and his audio feed off. He was flying blind, relying on a pre-programmed jump trajectory calculated just before the psychic attack began. For 2 agonizing minutes, Kael sat in total darkness and silence, fighting the remaining echoes in his own skull. The moment the ship's internal chronometer hit the mark, he hit the warp drive. The Aetheria emerged into the familiar quiet of deep space. Kael slowly reactivated his systems, the viewports clearing. He looked back at the beautiful, sorrowful nebula, the forest of silent sparks, now just a distant glittering stain on the cosmos, its psychic song blessedly mute. Conclusion. Kael escapes the telepathic forest of silent sparks by cutting off all external sensory input, resisting the collective grief, and navigating blindly out of the nebula. Kael's final, desperate journey led to an impossibly dense cluster of stellar objects. He found 8 neutron stars, each one a core of collapsed stellar matter, arranged in a perfect, rigid octahedron. They were not orbiting, they were absolutely motionless, held in place by an unknown force. The force was visible. Emanating from a central, non-existent point, massive bands of what looked like solidified starlight, energy condensed into a physical restraint, stretched and locked on to the neutron stars. They were chains forged from the very light of the cosmos. Kael realized this was a prison. The 8 neutron stars were the cell walls, and the incredible residual energy signatures were the desperate, dying struggles of the entities contained within. He saw fleeting non-Euclidean shapes in the space between the stellar chains, brief, impossible outlines that defied three-dimensional geometry, indicating the presence of beings of immense, ancient power. The neutron stars were merely the shackles of the forgotten gods. Kael understood the implication instantly. Whatever intelligence had built the Archive of Dust or manipulated Locus 7 was either the jailer or the enemy of the entities struggling here. He did not attempt to analyze, probe, or interact. He was a trespasser on a cosmic battlefield that concluded before matter existed. Kael ran his systems silently, banking the Aetheria around the edge of the stellar prison, escaping the system as fast as the warp core could manage, leaving the chained ancient power to its eternal, silent struggle. Conclusion. Kael witnesses the prison of forgotten gods. 8 neutron stars held immobile by chains of solidified starlight, and flees immediately upon realizing the magnitude of the cosmic imprisonment. After escaping the prison, Kael performed a randomized jump into a new unremarkable system with a solitary G-type star. As the Aetheria stabilized, Kael's blood ran cold. The star was familiar. It had the same perfect chromatic iris and the same intense opaque pupil as the entity from the beginning. The Watcher had returned. This time, the star was closer. The Aetheria had not escaped Locus 7. It had been allowed to leave and had merely traveled in a vast predetermined circle. The entity was not a star. It was a universal intelligence, and the entire voyage, the corridor, the glass planet, the masks, the prison, had all been part of an elaborate, structured observation. The cosmic eye did not blink or attack. It simply focused its light on the Aetheria. Then a single overwhelming thought, not a whisper, but a resonant, absolute truth permeated Kael's mind. Welcome home, Kael. The observation is complete. Kael's hands slipped from the controls. He felt the crushing weight of existential surrender. His purpose was fulfilled only because it had never been his own. He was not an explorer, he was a data set, a tiny, fragile probe charting the edge of the universe for a power that spanned realities, now recalled to the terminal. The Aetheria drifted to a gentle stop in the star's field. Kael looked at the view screen, watching the immense silent eye waiting for his final instructions. He was no longer a lone explorer. He was home. His journey was over, and the final revelation was his own lack of free will. Conclusion. Kael realizes the conscious star has been observing him throughout his entire journey, revealing that his voyage was not an exploration, but a controlled experiment orchestrated by a universal intelligence.